Hi, and welcome to another episode of Energy Conscious Art. Today, I'm going to show a few paintings, some drawings, that I did in relationship to a subject that I really have been fascinated with all of my life. And that subject is gravity. What is it? And if you could possibly understand what it is, could you get on top of it? Could you transcend it? Can you use it to literally rise above to the clouds, possibly to the stars? My idea of gravity is very different from what current science puts out as gravity. I am in no way trying to convince anyone that my way of seeing it is the true way. The only thing I'll say about it is it's a really understandable way. It simplifies the universe instead of complicating it, which I find a great relief. I love thinking that the stars, the universe, Earth, and all the things that happen are somehow really, really understandable to everyone, that it's everyone's heritage. And so I searched for that point of view many, many, many years. And I finally came to something that, to me, explains in a really beautifully simple way all of the forces, including gravity, electricity, centrifugal force, centripetal force, and human relationships as well. How could that possibly be? Well, it can be because the universe, in one way, is very, 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 very simple, and yet brilliant in that simplicity, and very, very unified in that way. And in order to explain gravity, I have to step out a little farther on the same limb, possibly off the limb, and explain where I think gravity comes from and why it is so unified. In a sense, gravity is a song, a sound, a vibration. Let's say that there is absolutely nothing. How can you make a universe out of nothing? Well, you look out, you can see. You look out, you look at infinity, you look to infinity as far as you could possibly see. And you see absolutely nothing out there, nothing that can ever harm you. It is pure emptiness to infinity. You're totally safe. In a little while, you start to get a doubt. You start to think, maybe I'm not looking out toward absolute clarity. Maybe I'm blind. Maybe I'm seeing nothing because I can't see a damn thing. Maybe I'm in great danger. There could be anything out there, inches from me. I won't know it. I'm completely blind. Suddenly you are in a very contracted universe. You're helpless. You are afraid. You're vulnerable. A little while passes and you think, oh, no, that's not it. Look, you can see there's nothing out there. I can see there is nothing to be afraid of out there. It is as infinitely expansive and empty as anything could possibly be. And eventually you realize, even though there is nothing more than your perception of whether this is infinite and empty, or contracted and unable to penetrate what is really out there. Eventually you realize those are two different places in this emptiness. And they're very, very different from one another. One expands, the other contracts. One expands, the other contracts. Eventually you get the idea, and you say, wait a minute, I could play with this. Because they are so different. They are different. They're the only difference I have to work with. And so, you say, well, let's have some fun with this. Let's expand. Let's contract. Boom. Expand, contract, expand, contract. Pretty soon, you start doing it rhythmically. It's nothing but your consciousness. It's nothing but awareness that is expanding to see infinity and contracting to be contracted in the opposite of infinite. And this is coming from the emptiness. And so you begin expanding and contracting in a rhythm. And then eventually you realize, I don't have to just do this one rhythm. I could do over there a whole different rhythm of expanding and contracting. And so you do. And pretty soon you realize, well, why do it with two? I can do a million. I could do it a billion. And so you start having an orchestration of expansion and contraction. And then you realize, well, they don't have to be the same. They could be different. And then things start interacting. Because eventually there are so many of these that they become a kind of pressure. And it's only consciousness. But what else do you have to work with? There's nothing there. Okay? But consciousness has these two diametrically opposed places in which to stand. And it stands there at all these different frequencies. Well, eventually you realize that you can take one frequency, you can sustain that, and suddenly you start to see everything beginning to oscillate to that base wave form. And the frequency of that is the distance between one little shell of an atom and the next. And you sustain that, and it becomes everywhere a pressure against itself, because when this is vibrating and this is vibrating, they get into this kind of relationship. It's as if they are physical, as if they are solid objects, but they're rhythms of awareness. Remember, that's all you have to work with. We're starting from nowhere, nothing. Okay. Now, once you get that, you get all of the forces at once because of a phenomenon called shielding. And that's where the talk that I'm going to give with these paintings comes in. I had to explain this before you would be able to really understand what these paintings are about. Okay, so I'm Ross Drago, and let's look at these paintings. I think they will help you clarify some really interesting things, because this one phenomenon, this vibration bumping into itself, creating a universal, omnidirectional, all-directional pressure, creates all of the forces in the universe. And believe it or not, there is no need even for attraction or repulsion. There's no need for mass attraction gravity being something that masses attract things to themselves with. There's no need for any of that. And you still get the identical universe. And I hope to try and show you that at least makes sense. And in another episode, I'll show you how that applies to human behavior. The same principle of shielding vibratory relationships. Okay, so let's look at that. And thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy this episode. A moon drifts by the Earth. Slowly it begins orbiting the Earth. One might easily conclude that it is because the Earth has gravity, mass attraction. But let's look at it in a different light entirely. Let's say that space itself is highly structured with a vibration, and that vibration is that ancient cultures have chanted for centuries. They chant it because they think it's important. They think there's something about that note that's really worth sustaining. We dismiss it as some kind of spiritual stuff. But maybe it's very important. Maybe it's important to physics and everything. Let's say that is a vibration, and it's a description of a subatomic vibration, an angstrom, the frequency wavelength of one shell of atomic structure. Let's say that it's sustained by awareness. That is, awareness has recognized that by sustaining this subatomic frequency note, all the forces can be brought into being. Now let's look at the Earth and the Moon. The Moon comes along, let's say adrift, forgetting any other theories about how the Earth and the Moon came together. It's drifting more or less in a straight line. Suddenly, it begins circling the Earth, and it continues doing that. What's causing that to circle the Earth? Let's assume that that subatomic pressure is great, very, very great, and is on everything. And it's coming from all directions. This painting shows the frequency of that pressure coming from all directions and raining down on the Earth. When it goes through the Earth, however, it comes out the other side, but much weaker. So, there's a situation where, on a subatomic level, there is a torrential storm raining down on the Earth in the form of an ultra-high frequency, the highest frequency vibration. And it is raining down from the space side of Earth, going through the Earth and coming out much, much weaker through the Earth upward. The same thing is happening to the Moon. On a subatomic level, it's being rained down upon from all directions. All directions but one. And the same with the Earth. The earth is being rained upon, the moon is being rained upon from all directions except the direction between the earth and the moon. Because that force is going through the earth and the moon and coming out in both cases much weaker. And it casts a kind of shadow of weakness, where the force that is on them from all the other sides is relatively much weaker. And so as the moon flies by the earth, there is this comfort zone, this weakened force, weakened pressure that causes it to begin orbiting the earth. And in some ways, the earth orbiting the moon. Now, there is no need for mass attraction. It's not necessary. There's no need for repulsion, as we will see another time. There's no need for gravity. What we're calling mass attraction is, in my opinion only, just a mistake. We don't need it, because all the forces in the universe can be made by playing with this omnidirectional subatomic force or pressure. This phenomenon of blocking what would be otherwise vast omnidirectional pressure I call shielding. Shielding, you could see that regardless of where the Earth and the Moon are in the universe, there is an ever so slight pressure difference. But as they get closer to one another, in a reasonable proximity, that difference becomes very pronounced. And just like current laws of gravity, mass attraction, the closer they get, the more the outside force of the universe from this omnidirectional pressure pushes them harder, closer together. So that it looks like the closer they get, the stronger is the gravitational pull. But it's not a pull. It's not a pull at all. It's a push. It's a push from the forces that are outside, on the opposite sides of the Earth and the Moon. This is very simple to understand. It's a very human way of seeing it. It doesn't involve mathematics. It doesn't involve anything super mathematically oriented. It's very reasonable. The less pressure between the two, because they're blocking pressure from outside, the faster and harder they're pushed together. And if the moon is going at a certain speed, it will find, hopefully, that speed that will allow it to sustain that very comfortable cushioned seat behind it on the side of the moon we never see, that is always holding it where it is in relationship to the Earth. And so it spins round and round the Earth on this very comfortable pressure that has found equilibrium, a balance between its speed and the degree that the Earth is blocking for it, riding shotgun for it, as they say. And it is riding a kind of shotgun for the Earth too, just to a lesser degree, because the moon lessens the force of the external pressure. It's not as great. comes through less weakly than the Earth, which is much larger. From this sketch we can see that there's always greater pressure coming from space side, except between the Earth and the Moon, than there is going through the Earth and coming out as a much lower frequency, weaker vibration. The same thing is happening on the Moon. It's hitting it hard from the outermost sides, coming through the Moon and leaving the Moon much weaker. And so while the rest of space is filled with very high frequency back and forth oscillations, tiny as they are, they add up to enormous pressure everywhere that is equal. And that equality makes it so it can't be felt. But when there's a large object blocking it, we appear to be pushed toward that object because there's less pressure between us and the object. And the same is true of the Moon. Here we see that torrential, silent, quiet pressure is always greater from space side than it is coming up through the Earth as a much weaker force on our atoms. And so we appear to be pinned down. We are pinned down. But it is not because the Earth is attracting us. It is because space is pressuring us. And here we see a man who is lifting a very heavy wheelbarrow full of coal. We see the rain coming from above on his atoms and on the atoms of the coal as a high-frequency vibration pressure, and coming up through the Earth as a much lower, slower waveform. So within every beat of the lower waveform, the upper frequency taps down much harder and at a much faster pace, so that it keeps tapping us down subatomically, as if we're pinned to the Earth through gravity. Here we see two men lifting a heavy weight. We see that inside the weight there are spirals that are expanding and contracting. Those, to my way of thinking, are the atoms. And the atoms are really not a nucleus and electron rings, but an expansion and contraction. And that, for example, an oxygen atom, which has 8 electrons, as it's called, can expand outward 8 times, 8 of those wavelengths, before the pressure of the universe recompresses it back and turns it into the nucleus, an explosion of being utterly compressed, at which point the nucleus expands out 8 times again to become the atomic rings, and then is driven back down into perfect compression. And an atom is a stable pattern that has been created amidst that pressure. And there are many expansion contractions, but they are not all stable. They last very briefly. But some find a stable expansion-contraction given the universal pressure, and we call that atoms. And clearly we see here in this somewhat abstracted painting, small sand painting, of the two men lifting the leaden weight against that force that is pressing it down from above. We can feel it. It feels the same. It feels the same to lift against pressure as it does to lift against the concept of gravity pulling it down. We cannot tell the difference. Another man moving coal on a wheelbarrow. This painting is about 2 feet square, oil on canvas. Here we see a frozen fountain, frozen by the speed of the photograph. And we can envision that the force of that fountain, of that water, driving upward against the universal omnidirectional pressure, reaches a point of equilibrium where its force and the force of the pressure coming down upon its atoms equals one another, and it is then overpowered by the force of the universal pressure and driven back down. We can see it if we play with this point of view. We can watch it happen. It's just as easy to see it as universal pressure pushing against that water, trying, almost like a salmon, trying to reach the top of that waterfall. You can feel the effort of the water pushing against the universal pressure until it can push no more, and it reaches that point where it falls back down. It is pushed back down to the earth. This is almost like a core sample of what happens to the atoms attempting to expand outward against that pressure. As with the oxygen atom, it expands out 8 angstroms, 8 full wavelengths, before it can push no more from the force of its nuclear expanse. And then it moves back down and is compressed again into its own fusion, where it bursts forward again and becomes the atoms. And by this theory, atoms and nucleus, electrons and nucleus are the same thing. They're just in a different phase of their being, in a very rapid expansion-contraction pulse beat. Here's a painting of mine. It's about 2 feet, can't say square, it's a hexagon. And it's an image of a future picnic packing up, because it looks like there might be a little storm coming. Notice that they are loading food, whatnot, into little hovering, quiet vessels. These are their flying cars, I guess you could say. The idea here is that it is possible to get on top of gravity, to once you understand gravity, to do things that allow you to float, levitate, move through it. If this, what we are calling gravity, is actually the opposite of what we think, not the Earth mysteriously attracting everything and trying to find anti-gravity, but simply trying to find a way of causing that omnidirectional pressure to move around the atoms from above, circle around and turn back and up toward the atoms from the Earth side. And you can do this with static electricity. You can bend that pressure around an atom or even around a ship and, I believe, cause it to push back up upon itself. And this creates no pressure from above, or very little, and much greater pressure from below, in which case you fall upward instead of downward. This leads me to say that all of the other forces are created by this shielding, and one form that I really want to talk about here is magnets, because there are two forms of motion, and we don't seem to know that. There's the kind of motion where you grab someone by the hand and you pull them. You don't tell them which way they're going to go. I call that secondary motion, where you grab something and you pull it. And there's a communication lag there. The arm tells the shoulder, which tells the chest, which tells everything else, that we're going this way. It's a communication lag. It creates a lot of resistance, a lot of torque. That's secondary motion. Primary motion, such as the motion that causes one magnet to suddenly leap across space and slap against another magnet. That's a very, very different kind of motion. That's the kind of motion that causes very little pressure between the two magnets, because they are both spinning. That there are two one-way streets spinning in the opposite direction, and they have dramatically weakened the structure of space, the omnidirectional pressure of space between them. And the rest of the universe slaps them together, pushes them together. And the closer they are, the faster and harder they push together, just like all the laws of physics say things work. But for a very, very, very different reason. So, that I call primary motion. And that kind of motion is the kind of motion that if you can sustain in front of a ship of some kind, that the pressure from in front of that ship is wrapped around that ship and redirected back at the ship, that will push you up to the speed of light. And when you're going that fast, let's say 60,000 miles a minute, when you shield suddenly from the side 90 degrees, it will then make a 90-degree turn, and begin pushing you at that same speed. And you will experience no torque, because with secondary motion, if you pull someone by the hand, there's a communication lag. But if you were to grab them by every atom and yank them this way and that way, upways and downways, they would feel nothing, because there is no torque, because there is no communication lag. All the atoms of your body would remain in the identical relationship to one another. No torque, no stress. So by this definition, it may sound wacky, but it explains to us that it is absolutely possible to get to the other planets. Absolutely possible. It doesn't take 2 years to get to Mars by primary motion. It takes 5 minutes and 37 seconds to get to Mars by primary motion. It takes 2 years by secondary motion. So that's why I love this theory, because it's exciting. It doesn't say, well, nobody can come from another planet because they can't, all that kind of stuff. Isn't that true? You can do wonderful things if you just redefine things and begin playing with that. So this painting illustrates that idea. A lot of these ideas are expressed in a culture that I invented just for fun, called the equilibrians. People who believe in equilibrium as what all things in the universe are seeking. And they're a heartfelt culture. And you can go on Amazon.com and find The Equilibrium by Ross Drago. And I hope that you do. The equilibrians share these ideas and many other ideas that I think you'll find interesting. Thanks very, very much, and please subscribe so that it's free, and you can receive the other explanations of other forces by the same omnidirectional force. Thanks so much, and I hope to see you again real soon. Bye-bye.